Well, I wanted to thank the Human Life Alliance for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I've looked forward to having the idea of stealth euthanasia explored and revealed to the public for a long time, but I'm also sad that it's gotten that bad that people all across the country are realizing how bad it actually is. But this goes back to the respect for life, that a person is not just a human being as defined, but is a child of God. Well, actually, this stealth euthanasia problem arises out of an ethics change that occurred back in the 70s. And the reason that occurred was back in 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was started by the U.S. Public Health Service. And what they did was they did not treat those patients who had syphilis because they wanted to study the end stages of that disease. And eventually in 1972, the experiment, after 40 years, was continuing, and it was discovered and reported in the Associated Press. So what happened was the Congress instituted a national commission in 1974, which resulted in the Belmont Report of 1978. And the Belmont Report was created with the idea that ethics needed to be strengthened to prevent what happened in the Tuskegee experiment. But we did not need a new ethics. The ethics were already there. The divine law not to kill was already there. What actually happened was they created a new secular ethics so that they could continue experimentation of various sorts on fetuses, embryos, and other human beings. And they came up with the concept of autonomy or respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. But not justice as we define it, the just treatment of a human being, but justice in not allocating scarce medical resources for those who are unworthy of life. Or beneficence, thinking what is good for the patient, well, they're thinking of what is good for society, so they may kill patients for the greater good of society. They did not have reverence for life, and this is the source of the stealth euthanasia movement into our healthcare system. I've been reading a lot about Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and some of the other saints, and we're in the same struggle, and it's a struggle between those who revere life and those who do not revere life at all and who use deception and lies in everything they do, almost everything out of their mouth. If they are a culture of death, they do not speak the truth. They mislead the families and the patients, and they misuse healthcare in horrible and tragic ways. I get the calls. I've been getting them. I man the phones 24 hours a day. Sometimes sometimes I wake up and get a call at 3 in the morning and something tells me I have to answer that phone. And I remember I was at a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina a couple of years ago, and 3 in the morning, it was the night before the conference, and Mary Bascom was on the phone. Her mother was being killed in New York State, and she's an RN, and she couldn't do anything to stop it. She had the power of attorney, but her brother and the hospice had created a new one. So you think you're safe when you carefully fill out your living will or your advance directive or whatever it is, power of attorney form, and all the thought that you go into it. You could consult with an attorney, but when it's culture of death that's in charge, everything can be misused and all laws are meaningless, because that is the meaning of the culture of death. There is no law. Law is from God, and the human law reflects God's law in a moral society. And we have to be conscious that we in the pro-life movement, we're confronting a force. If you really get effective and see what really is going on here, then that dark side or culture of death is going to start noticing you. And they don't like it when Alex and people like me and others bring out the truth of what is going on. And we need everyone to pray and to get involved, because this is not small. It is pervasive. It is in every healthcare system. And sorry to say, it's in the Catholic healthcare system as well. I don't mean to offend people here, but I get calls from Catholic people with family members in the Catholic hospital, for example, Holy Cross in Fort Lauderdale, and some out on the West Coast. I know very well some of the things that were said. I've had chaplains call me and tell me the nun said they just put down some patient with euthanasia, and it was a nun, and I was shocked. So we have to purify what we do, and prayer does matter. This is not something new, though. And like I said, Augustine and St. Thomas, they were fighting these things. The culture of death has been forever, all time, as long as man has been in a fallen state. And that's what original sin is really what it is. It is that assertion that we're going to be something that is not what God wants us to be. We want to be what we want to be. We want to do what we want to do. If we don't find that loved one lovable anymore, if they're not convenient, if they're hard to take care of, if we need too much time to take care of them, we will use the healthcare system to kill them. So people who are pro-life, most of them don't really understand how this could be so bad and how people can be killed. And they also don't understand that the law is not on the pro-life side. It's not Roe v. Wade alone. It goes back to the Euthanasia Society and their work since 1939, and even before socialism and some other people who were working to change our society from a constitutional government to something that is quite different. If we go back to 1932, for example, we may remember the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was put on by the U.S. public health system. And they decided not to treat a few hundred black men who had syphilis, and they basically abandoned them to their disease because they said they wanted to study the end stage. And if you do that, it endangered the families, the children, anybody else involved with them, and they lied to them consistently, saying they were giving free health care and a lunch and some food and so on. But that's the kind of mindset of the culture of death. And this experiment went on for 40 years till 1972. And this is really important for you guys to understand. In 1972, the AP, some investigative journalist said, "Hey, this is really bad. What have you done?" So it became national news, and then the Congress said, well, we need a commission to have a way of making sure this never happens again. And they didn't have to have a new national commission, but they did. In 1974, the Congress authorized the creation of the National Commission for experimentation on human beings and fetuses and so on, because they knew with abortion there's going to be embryos to experiment upon. They were thinking, we want to experiment on people, whether they're unborn or born or whatever. So the whole idea that we needed new ethics was a lie. But under the guise of saying we needed to protect people, they created the circumstances that the culture of death we see today could happen. So what happened, the National Commission, they met at the Belmont House in Washington or Maryland, down that way. And anyway, they issued the Belmont Report in 1978, and the principles that they came up with, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with: autonomy or respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These are the secular bioethics. And you can't understand stealth euthanasia without understanding that in 1978, the Congress had printed these ethics into law in the Federal Register. And these ethics became the law of the land, throwing out basically the Constitution, any right to life, as long as you can justify it based on, if you say patient autonomy or respect for persons, that gets into what Alex was talking about with assisted suicide or the living wills, the advance directives, and you get the idea that a vulnerable person who, like Terry Schiavo or someone else, who cannot make a decision for themselves, they have a surrogate decision maker who can say, yes, go ahead, kill me, or withdraw life-sustaining treatment or whatever, and they end up dead. That's under the guise of autonomy, the patient themselves saying, this is what I would want. Okay, but you could have an abusive surrogate who seizes control, or an adult child of an elderly person who seizes control, gets guardianship or the power of attorney, and says, okay, we're going to put this person into hospice, even though they're not terminal. And it's fraud to admit them. Just like Terry Schiavo was not terminal, her medical records show that. She was put into hospice fraudulently and done so at the instigation of the Hospice of the Florida Suncoast, which the chairman of the board was George Filos, a pro-euthanasia attorney, and the chairman of the board was Mary Labiak, a pro-euthanasia CEO of a hospice, one of the main hospices in the country. So the National Commission, when they changed the law to secular ethics, nobody in the country pretty much noticed. But the training for all the doctors, the nurses, and everybody else, see, it works like this: public health, U.S. public health system, state public health system, local county public health system, all the university research is governed by these secular bioethics, not Christian reverence for life, not the Hippocratic oath that says do no harm, or the standards of care that say we will never abandon our patient. So then you have judges, attorneys, and doctors and nurses and everybody else being trained in the secular bioethic principles, which is quality of life is more important than reverence for life. And we know life is from God. God gives us that life, and every patient we see, as Sister Bernadette Subaru told us, every person is a child of God. So we have to approach every patient with reverence for their life, and every patient has to have reverence for their own life. But we've forgotten that. We've gotten away from that understanding of life, that there is suffering. There's always suffering in life. Everybody has some form of suffering. The culture of death wants to eliminate suffering, and they want to control things. So they want to control death. They want to control life. They never live. They don't understand. You cannot live without embracing suffering and loving, and then you come through that and transform the life. And so we who work in healthcare, we have to serve our patients with that spirit. Okay, these secular bioethics, they also use the principle of beneficence for the good of society. And this is the rationale used by the Nazis. The National Socialists in Germany during the war and before the war, they said for the good of society and because our budget, the economy is pretty bad, it was terrible, they didn't have a lot of money, we're going to kill off the helpless, the vulnerable. And in their T4 euthanasia program, they went in and killed the disabled summarily. They just executed them with a gun in some cases, or morphine and so on. The Nazis perfected the morphine killing. And you can read a book called The Nazi Doctors. It talks a lot about the horrors of that time. But the secular bioethics that we embrace in this country legally, or our Congress did, is the same kind of ethics the Nazis used, and that's why we're seeing the same results. Justice. The kind of justice that we recognize is the justice that protects the vulnerable. But under secular bioethics, they say justice is the just allocation of scarce medical resources. Therefore, we will set a reimbursement rate for doctors and hospitals that is less than what it costs to provide the service, especially if you're over 65 or something, and therefore you'll end up in hospice rather than getting the surgery or whatever you need. So the people at the national level, they knew what was coming down the pike. They knew what they wanted to do. They set up the secular bioethics, and they also got brain death criteria with the irreversible coma definition by the Harvard Committee in 1968. So they redefine everything. They redefine life. They say you're dead even though you're alive, as Dr. Paul Byrne tells us. You know, if you're dead, your organs are decaying, you're not breathing, your heart's not beating, nothing, everything is immediately starting to decay. But they wanted the organs for a transplantation, and so they gave us the brain death definition, and then they keep widening it so that it's not just brain death, but it's permanent vegetative state and minimally conscious state, and you're just cognitively disabled or developmentally disabled. They are killing them routinely all across the country and probably many parts of the world. Okay. Now, at the same time, all of this stuff is happening at the same time. In the 50s and 60s, you had Timothy Leary with the drug experimentation, and the idea was, okay, tune in, you know, take some drugs and tune out or whatever. And one of the main mottos of that time was challenge authority. And they got the idea, the counterculture, we're going to throw out traditional morality. Parallel to the same thing that Congress did, but this was intentionally done at the university level so that it would spread throughout the country, knowing that the university students would eventually become the leaders of society. They would become the doctors, the lawyers, and the politicians and other powerful people. So this drug culture, which is a poison to our culture, along with challenging traditional morality, you stand morality and the divine law and natural law on end, upside down, and you get what we have today. And you have 4 generations now, basically, since that time, being raised in a culture of death, so that when you have young people today, some of them, yes, some of them, fortunately, may find the moral path. They may. But the society, the culture, the media is all pretty much culture of death. Very entertaining, technologically fantastic, but no reverence for God, no reverence for life, and it's always mocked pretty much in the mainstream media. So the message the people are getting is disrespect for life, and then when it gets into the healthcare setting, that's what you see. Okay, now hospice. You want to understand hospice. We can't understand hospice today, without going back, and there are some people here who were original hospice people, they really understand the true mission of hospice was a Christian pro-life mission. Dame Cicely Saunders, a doctor in England, she worked with the nurses and the sisters and worked with the dying. And she said, we can do a better job of caring for people at the end of life, allowing them to live fully as long as they are alive, and then they die a natural death. But she would be horrified to see what's happened to hospice. And how this has happened is the Euthanasia Society of America, like Alex was saying, they would try to legalize euthanasia, get the laws changed. From 1939 onwards, they kept on trying. They never stop. They will never stop. For thousands of years, they've been around. People like that. Plato was a euthanasia proponent. Eugenics, that's right out of Plato. You could be the most logical person, but if you don't have reverence for life and God, you will be on that other side favoring the devaluation of life. So the Euthanasia Society got tricky. They said, well, our name is a problem. We have to change it. So they became, they looked at America. We're a society we like to think about rights. The right to this and the right to that, the right to free speech. Well, they talk about the Society for the Right to Die. That's what their new name was. Okay, they thought that would be a better way to market the idea of death. And then they changed it to choice in dying, because we're about choice. We want choice. And at that time, they brought in the living wills and the advance directives. There was an attorney in Indiana, Lewis Kuttner, who wrote an article about advancing the cause of euthanasia through the living will, that the living will and advance directive is the incremental means of achieving legalization or actual practice of euthanasia, which is their goal. So when people say you have to have an advance directive or a living will, you may want to think about that, because the moment you have a DNR or a living will or an advance directive, some doctors misinterpret that and they will say, oh, you're ready to die. We're not going to treat your UTI, your urinary tract infection. We're not going to treat your pneumonia or your bronchitis. We're going to send you over to hospice, or we're not even going to do the surgery. We may not even feed you because you've got this. Even if you have a DNR that says, I don't want extreme measures to resuscitate me, they misinterpret that to mean, we're giving up on you, just let me die. That's not what you mean. But they use it, all of these documents. The most important thing you need is a living person right near you when you're a patient who knows your values, that you revere life, and you understand that we have a duty to live as God wants us to until He's finished with us. So that person you have to name as your power of attorney, and you have to do the uncomfortable thing and tell every single person in your family and every friend and give them a copy that Joan here, she's my power of attorney and nobody else, because she understands I'm pro-life and I respect life. Okay? So anyway, the Euthanasia Society, they became Choice in Dying. They gave us the living wills and so on. And Choice in Dying merged with Partnership for Caring, which was a hospice organization run by Ira Byock. He's a big hospice leader. And he was running the Missoula Demonstration Project out in Montana, which was a rallying point center for Last X, which was another hospice coalition. So you have a hospice organization, Partnership for Caring, and I've talked to him. He wanted to change the laws about hospice to make it more hospice friendly, more palliative care friendly. They knowingly absorbed Choice in Dying, which was the successor of the Euthanasia Society. So what does that tell you? It tells you that when he says he is pro-life, he was at a conference in Michigan near Detroit, a couple of months ago, and he said to the audience, "I am pro-life." He consciously absorbed the Euthanasia Society into his organization, and on the board of Partnership for Caring was who? Mary Labiak, the CEO of the hospice that killed Terry Schiavo. They are euthanasia people infiltrating the hospice movement. And then Partnership for Caring merged with Last Acts to become Last Acts Partnership. In 2004, they were absorbed by the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, the lobbying group, the trade organization, the only one for all the hospice agencies in the country, absorbed legally and corporately, became the successor to the Euthanasia Society of America. And what they called their program Caring Connections. You can go to their website and you will see that their work is the proliferation of the living wills and the advance directives, because they know these are incremental steps or permission slips to do stealth euthanasia. The doctors interpret it. Hey, I've got one of these. You don't have to do real medical care. Okay, so we got to Dame Cicely Saunders. She had founded St. Christopher's Hospice in 1967. Coming at this a little differently, I'm going back and forth, but I'm trying to get you to really understand this. She was a Christian, but in the United States, Florence Wald was the Dean of Nursing at Yale University, and she, although she wasn't the only founder of the hospice movement in this country, she is generally recognized as the United States founder of hospice. And she founded the first hospice, the Connecticut Hospice, in 1974. And she was not pro-life. And she, a famous quote in the Journal of the American Medical Association, you can look that up, quotes her as saying she was in favor of assisted suicide for physical, emotional, social, and economic reasons. Now you tell me, in your mind, you can spend all day, all year figuring out a justification for assisted suicide based on economic reasons. It's not the patient's economic reasons, it might be the family's economic reasons, it might be the society's economic reasons because of the budget, Medicare, Medicaid, or whatever, or the HMO. But that tells you that the flavor of hospice that has been sold to us in the United States under the guise of Dame Cicely Saunders' mission, which is pro-life, actually had the undercurrent of stealth euthanasia from the very beginning in 1974 in the United States. Now, there were people in the United States who were pro-life who founded hospices, but they have always butted heads with this other group that has seized control and basically had control of the industry at the national level all along. Okay, now we get into a little bit of what Alex was talking about, compassion and choices, the Hemlock Society. There's two sides to the culture of death, basically. You can look at it that way. There's the covert mission and the overt. Overt meaning we know about compassion and choices, we know about Hemlock Society, we know about Final Exit Network with their suffocation bags, plastic bags, and all of that stuff. But there's the covert euthanasia, which was what? Well, Euthanasia Society gave up on open legalization, so they went stealth. They said, we're going to trick the American public. We're going to, Marlene was talking about that, that we're cooked. You know, you raise the temperature of the water, the frog doesn't jump out, or the lobster doesn't notice. Well, our society, we're cooked. We're already way beyond it getting hot. It's already boiling. It's been boiling for a long time, and they've been killing people all over the country. So under the idea of going stealth, they did infiltrate and become the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization became the successor. And so you have covert euthanasia through hospice and the healthcare system itself. Because remember, Most of the doctors, lawyers, social workers that are dealing with the healthcare system have been educated in the secular bioethics. They are no longer taught Hippocratic oath in most medical schools. There's something called the Lasagna oath. It's the modern physician's oath. There was a Dr. Lasagna. Anyway, a funny name, but that's the reality. And in there it says that, there's actually a line, I have it in my Stealth Euthanasia book, but it says, if it be given to me to take a life, and something like right before it, it says, we should not play God, but if it is within my power, or if it arrives that I have to take a life, you have to do it with care or whatever. It's like the American public, if they had ever read that, they would have been shocked. But many of our doctors, they're educated in that philosophy. They might not be thinking of the oath they took when they graduated from medical school, but they have been taught those principles in their thinking and their decision making all throughout medical school and their residencies, and the peer pressure from other doctors. This is pervading the healthcare system. So the idea of euthanasia is the covert side. It's the whole healthcare system. You go into the healthcare system in some places and you're possibly a target. If you don't look right, if you've got a brain injury, if you are disabled and need a lot of services and they think you're using up too many medical services. I have a patient who has spina bifida, 40 years old, and care for him. He would have been dead upon birth according to what the doctors wanted to do. And they, because they were eugenics kind of people, they refused to do the surgery that he needed, and they caused a lot of problems and blindness. But he's conscious, he's there, we love him and he loves us. But we understand there's something mysterious happening. There are people, I don't know if you've worked with the developmentally disabled and so on, but they're people just like you and me. They have a soul. They may not function the same way, but God has a purpose, and they can teach us. He's our teacher to learn how to love. So. Okay, now, the thing about all these laws, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and then the idea that in hospice you can be killed. Some people will say, well, why go to hospice? If you're going to be killed, why not just, it's sort of like playing us from one side back and forth, corralling us towards an unavoidable conclusion that we have to legalize euthanasia, because they'll say, well, in hospice they use what's called terminal sedation. If a patient's truly agitated or psychotic, they need to be sedated. They're a danger to themselves and others. They can get up and fall and hurt themselves. So we sedate them if they're truly agitated, but it's very rare. It's not every patient. And I get calls from people saying every patient at the facility is sedated. And when they asked why, the nurse said, any patient who comes here is agitated, so we sedate them. They are permanently sedated. This is called palliative sedation, total sedation, terminal sedation, or permanent sedation. It's all the same thing. It's what's called third-way killing. This is stealth euthanasia. If you go to lifetree.org, our friend, pro-life friend Betty Wickham has done an Ione Whitlock. They did the research. They showed all the connections in how the culture of death has influenced hospice, where the money came from, the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and George Soros, Project on Death and Dying. These guys have turned our hospices upside down. But they're corralling us because the permanent sedation, so it takes 2 weeks to die for somebody who's really hydrated or less. And people, the public will say, why go through that? Why don't you just inject me, like Alex was talking about? The euthanasia legalization, to the secular mind, that has no reverence for God, no understanding the purpose of life, well, why should I suffer? Just kill me like a dog. That's how they think. Okay, back to the some of the big names and how the culture was changed. You may want to check out the Hastings Center, George Soros Project on Death and Dying. The Project on Death and Dying is very interesting because they have given grants to doctors of nursing and doctors of palliative care, physicians, and others who research and practice in palliative care. But it's a culture of death approach to palliative care and hospice. And so there's money for the doctors, and they're being trained in the secular bioethics, the culture of death. Some of the big names internationally: Joanne Lynn, Timothy Quill, Ira Byock. Ira Byock wrote a book, Dying Well. You know the word euthanasia? Eu means good, thanasia, Thanos, death, good death, dying well. So he says he's against euthanasia and assisted suicide. You have to understand this. If you understand anything, understand when they say they're against assisted suicide and euthanasia, they don't mean they're against euthanasia in principle. They're against, they say they're against it. They're for third-way killing. And they have been quoted. Timothy Quill and Byock, they were involved in a lawsuit, and it involved this terminal sedation, which was pronounced, oh, it's okay to sedate people. And so the third-way killing is confusing to people who don't understand the issues. And we need to educate them that there's third-way killing, or it's called third path, some people call it that. It's all this permanent sedation. You go to sleep, you're peaceful, and you're just laying there, and your kidneys keep cranking out urine, and the water is removed from your body. Your fluid volume in your blood circulatory system decreases, so you have what's called a fluid volume deficit. There's not enough fluid in the veins and arteries to pump, and it collapses and you die. It is intended. So Joanne Lynn, who is a very powerful palliative care expert or a leader on the international level, working with the UN and the International and Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, she and others, they say, I don't need euthanasia-assisted suicide. We can stop food and fluid. I can sedate them. They'll die. So when patients ask to be killed, or family members ask that the patient be killed, these hospice people throughout the country will say, of course, we'll take care of it. We'll sedate them. We'll give them a little morphine. We'll give them a little Ativan or whatever, Valium. They'll be sedated. They'll be peaceful. Don't worry about it. They'll be dead. A week or two, and you can get your inheritance. That's what it's about. Okay, now, stealth euthanasia. The third-way killing is not the only way they use. Probably you'd have to be a hospice nurse and having actually worked within hospice to fight off all the lies and all the deceptions that could be thrown at you. It's very difficult. So you really need to educate yourself. I've gotten calls of doctors, MDs, crying on the phone because their parent had been killed in hospice. And sometimes, and more than one physician I'm talking about, and nurses, RNs and others, because maybe the other family member had the power of attorney and they were culture of death. And they wielded hospice to kill their parent or their wife or husband or whoever. Or I have the grandchildren calling me. So it's not just sedation. They can tell the patient, like was mentioned, Did you mention it, Alex? I don't know. About the voluntary stopping eating and drinking. So you just tell a person, well, you want to die, just stop eating and drinking. You'll die. Rather than supporting life in the healthcare system, the nurses and doctors, healthcare is a spiritual mission. We're here to serve the children of God. And so when someone says, I want to die, we should be loving them, comforting them, helping them to recognize that they still have value and that there's a purpose in their life. And they may be depressed. We have to help them. We don't give them a gun to shoot themselves. We don't sedate them. But there are other methods used too. We hear a lot about outright direct euthanasia in hospice, in the hospitals as well. You know, used to think, oh, in hospice they can do anything because it's not enforced, so they know morphine's there, but in a hospital they wouldn't dare do this. No, they're doing this in hospitals. Okay? They are, I remember Holy Cross Hospital in Fort Lauderdale, and I'll name them. And Cindy is the daughter, the RN who called me, or Candy, excuse me. And her mother and grandmother were in the hospital at one time. It was just a coincidence, but they were killing the grandmother. And they wouldn't put in a feeding tube, but they had no IV going. And then they sedated her. This is another trick. They sedate the patient and then give them some water, and they may choke. And then they say, you can't swallow. It's dangerous. It would go in their lungs. So you have to recognize, you have to bring them out of sedation and say, no more sedation, and then you can feed them and give them fluid, because one minute they're walking, talking, eating, drinking, the next minute they can't swallow. It doesn't make sense. So there's all sorts of lies. You have to trust your instincts. Other methods are very common: COPD and emphysema patients. They have a poor breathing effort. And all across the country, nurses in hospice are being taught morphine helps your breathing. But morphine suppresses the breathing. It is a lie. In a very a small area where they have heart failure, end stage, and pulmonary edema in their fluid in the lungs, they give a very small dose of morphine, and they always get a diuretic to reduce the fluid. And then that helps that in the heart failure case. But in almost all other cases, it's a lie. Morphine suppresses and slows the breathing and will stop the breathing. And for a patient who has COPD, they die very quickly, very easily. Sometimes they give unnecessary potassium, or they use bad technique to contaminate their trach or urinary tube and cause sepsis, and then don't treat the infection. The police and the district attorneys are responsible for this because they won't prosecute. You can complain to every department of government, and they will not act on the stealth euthanasia. We've had people for years. Passing laws are not going to stop this. I know we have to try to pass proper laws, and we have to fight the legalization, but that's not going to stop it. We have to change the culture to a culture of life, to reverence for life, and we have to teach the children, we have to teach the nurses, the doctors, and because I finally realized making a complaint, advocacy is not enough. You have to have a safe healthcare system. So we're going to be forming a pro-life healthcare alliance to plant seeds of reverence for life in all the different provider agencies, so that when people go to a hospice or a hospital or a nursing home or a school, it will find them or will create them somehow. God will help us. The patient cannot be safe until the healthcare system itself reveres life. And that's really what we need to understand.